Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, good morning. Welcome. Glad to see everyone this morning. Before we dive in, does anybody have any insights, questions, comments, observations about first service? For those who are here, if you weren't here and you want to make comments, I suppose that's okay too. Tyler.
What does it mean to stand? And here's what I mean by I'm asking that question. Obviously, we have writings of the Apostle Paul that says that in the body we have different functions.
Yep.
There are some people who are very extroverted about their faith. There are some who kind of keep it closer to
Yeah. I don't think he's referring to that in that sense. It's more being faithful to what we believe. Don't give up on our confession. Whether you're an extrovert and you're sharing it, or we're just not going to let somebody else. Even an introvert knows when something's wrong.
I'm not saying you did,
Yeah.
but I have
No.
heard that sermon preached that way in other traditions where the pastor seems to be trying to make everybody like be very extrovert. I'm not saying you did that
No.
at all.
But I think that would be a misunderstanding of the stand firm. The stand firm is firm on the doctrine. Don't give up on what we believe, teach, and confess. Yeah. Other comments, questions, observations? Yes.
That was very good. I think, I'm actually Immanuel about the resurrection. And we were talking about a couple of
With denominations, that have kind of made the belief in the resurrection optional. Yeah, I mean, then what do you exist to do if you don't preach the resurrection? And I didn't want to say it in the sermon but you know, the UCC, United Church of Christ, has made belief in the resurrection optional. And not so much in terms of, hey, you don't have to believe in it, but it's, you know, when they say Jews, Muslims, Baha'i can also be saved, then by that kind of a statement, you're saying that the belief in the resurrection is optional. So they would never say, I believe the resurrection optional, but by their other statements, they make it optional.
There was a female pastor in the PCUSA.
Yeah.
The clerk went out on Protestios, the Twitter site, where she said, did Christ raise from the dead? I don't know. Does it matter? No.
Yeah. And you hear that stuff.
That's PCUSA.
It's Presbyterian Church USA. So again, the point wasn't to kind of point the finger at all the bad guys, but say how important it is for us. So yeah, there are individuals. Obviously, the Unitarians would be a group that would not make resurrection a doctrinal foundation. So. Yeah. United Church of Christ, I'm not sure where their history is. Yeah, unfortunately, and again, the whole point wasn't to kind of point out all the fingers at the bad guys. It was just saying for us how important it is that we hold that. But there are some who claim Christianity and say that the resurrection isn't that important, like you've got preachers saying that today. So the resurrection is the essence of what we wake up to every morning. So other comments, questions? Just little highlights. I did go to Best Practices this week in Phoenix, which was really good. I've been to it, 3 times. Some of those have been there. It's an amazing experience. I would encourage anybody. You don't have to be a church leader. You don't have to be a professional. If you would like to do that, start thinking about it. It's usually, the middle of February. The conference itself is free. Everything's free. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner's all provided. There's no registration costs. All your sectionals are included. And all the food you can eat between the sectionals. It just overwhelm you? And it's topics on everything you can imagine about what's going on within the congregation, from technology and how to use it to teaching math and science in a Christian classroom, how to govern the church and the school board, and dealing with grief. There were a couple today a couple this time on families dealing with children or loved ones who think that they're trans. How does the church respond to those kinds of topics? And it's people who are living this in their church every day who come and say, this is what we're doing. So it's well worth anybody going. And so we were certainly encouraged that. I did mention in the prayers this morning, if you heard, praying for the faculty and staff of Valley Lutheran. We took different flights coming back because the faculty and staff all came. They were flying from Phoenix to Denver to Cedar Rapids. I flew directly from Cedar Rapids to Phoenix. Their flight to Denver got canceled last night or yesterday afternoon, and they waited till midnight at the airport from 11 in the morning till midnight. They finally got rebooked to Chicago, where they were going to have to rent cars and drive to Cedar Rapids to pick up their cars. We just heard during first service they finally left the airport in Chicago. So they had a great conference. I'm just afraid that when they get back here, they never want to go again. But don't let that happen now. I left at 3:30 and I was home by 9, so it was really, I don't think they want to see me for a while as I brag about that. But so yeah, and with all seriousness, pray for them that, they have safe travel. They're tired, they're exhausted, they're probably in each other's face, when you've been doing that for that long. But we appreciate it. And part of it, I bring up best practices because it was a little bit about what we're going to do today. We've been talking about kind of the church and ministry and the role of the pastor and the call. And then last week we talked about the history of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and why that's important, because one of the controversies that others have had, but we as LCMS have not, was what's the relationship between the congregation and the denomination? Is it a oversight? Is it a hierarchical where we are told from the top down, or is it a bottom up, or some combination? Which one is biblical? Which one is most appropriate to what God defines? And so this conversation, a lot of denominations wrestle with this, the hierarchical authority or the complete congregational, a sense of autonomy, but they still have a rough collection of beliefs, maybe in a national church body. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, I think, is consistent with our biblical foundations, or our Reformation foundation, is that the Bible does not give us a church politic design. Whether you're top down or bottom up or something in the middle, there's nothing in the scriptures that tell you how the churches are supposed to organize themselves in relationship to each other. Now, obviously, the Bible didn't have denominations, but even then, the closest thing they had was bishops, and the bishop would kind of oversee, but it was more of an organization. Our church body, when we came to America, was heavily influenced by the freedoms of the Constitution. Everyone gets to vote. We are a democratic or representative democracy where we are represented. And so that living in America, growing up in America, was different than the churches had in Germany. Remember when they left with Martin Stephan in Germany, they were hierarchical, and the government could tell them what they had to do. When they got here, they kind of rebelled against this government telling us, or even top down, to a congregational foundation. And as a church body, we have the right, as congregations, we are not completely autonomous, but closer to it. The congregation is the foundation of our denomination. And there's nothing, unless it's a doctrinal statement, we believe in infant baptism, that the synod passes that they can force on us as a congregation. So everything that they say is recommended, encouraged, those kinds of language, because we are from the bottom up in our congregation. And how, as a congregation, we organize ourselves. How do we do the business of the church, if you will? And I know people don't like to talk about that, but there is business in the church. You have to pay the mortgage, you have to pay the light bill, you have to get somebody to plow the snow or mow the lawn, or you have to accommodate yourself to government authorities. How do you organize themselves? How do you do that? So every congregation is kind of free to kind of organize themselves in a way that they see fit. So we don't have a structure that's recommended for us. With that as the lead up for this, I wanted to talk about how Immanuel does it. Some of you may be familiar with what's our organizational structure, how does it operate internally. Some of you may not, and I thought, well, this is maybe a chance to kind of look at the way we have chosen to organize ourselves as congregation. Other congregations are going to do it different, and that's perfectly okay. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. So that's kind of the foundational premise of what we're doing here. We switched in Myron, it was, 12 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, I know you were on that group, maybe a couple others were, we switched from what would be called a board or a typical kind of board structure to a policy structure as a congregation. We made that denomination. The old structure of Immanuel was you had the congregation, the voters are always the top supreme authority. And underneath them, the voters would elect members of different boards and committees. You had the building and property, you had the missions committee, you had the stewardship committee, you had the education committee, you had the school board. And so the congregation would elect members to all of these different boards, and I think we had about 12 or 15 at one point. And from those boards, they would either elect a chairman, and the chairman of those 12 or 15 boards would make the church council. So you had the voters, then the church council, which was made up of the chairmans of the 12 boards, and then the 12 boards may have subcommittees and groups. So that was kind of the organizational structure. And that's where most congregations still today kind of operate under that church council structure, if you will. We switched to what's called a policy-based governance, and I'm going to get into why we did that and what it looks like. But to kind of do this, why we felt it was okay and why we look at the structure is it's not unbiblical to have an organizational structure within the congregation. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses had led the people of Israel out of slavery where they've been for 400 years. And you're talking maybe 2 to 3 million people coming out of Egypt and living in the desert. How do they organize themselves? They had never had an organizational system. So Moses organized them into tribes. But even then, the governance of this, how do you decide what tribe goes first and what tribe settles where and how do they do all that stuff, that governance had not been dictated by God. And all of that was put upon Moses. Everything from the highest level to the order in which we're marching through the desert, because no one wants to be last. If you're last following 3 million people through the desert, what's it going to look like by the time you get to the overnight campsite? You can't breathe because of the dust and the dirt and the stuff. So you want to be out front, Who's going to fight where? So all of those decisions from that high level to Dave's mad at Bob because Bob borrowed one of his trowels and never gave it back. That argument would make it all the way up to Moses to settle the dispute between the two of them. So from the highest level to the lowest level, Moses was trying to dissolve all the challenges of leadership. And by the time he got to his home in the desert before he went to Egypt, his father-in-law Jethro said, "You're going to kill yourself," quite literally, working day and night trying to just organize all these things. And Jethro in chapter 18 says, what you do is you just break it up into thousands and hundreds and 50s and tens and have somebody organize. And so the whole point of that is not this is how we have to do it, but the idea of structure is important for efficiency in terms of doing God's work. So that's the whole point of it. So there is an importance to have a structure so that everyone isn't just doing their own thing. Does that make sense? We all agree to that. So it's a biblical idea of structure. So what we have, and I know you can't see this, but I'll try to explain to it. This is what what do you call this? Which kind of chart is this? Organizational structure chart? Yeah. Org chart, yeah. The top line, it's kind of a light blue or green. That's the voters at Immanuel. The voters are the highest authority in the congregation. They make major decisions for the congregation. Whether we want to buy property, whether we want to sell property, or we're going to take out a loan, calling a pastor. Those are the kinds of decisions that the top level make. They are guided by the bylaws and the Constitution. The bylaws and the Constitution guide the congregation and tell us what we're going to believe, that we believe the Bible, that we believe the Old New Testament, that who can vote, who can't, those kinds of big levels, how you have to call a pastor, what boards and committees we're going to have, but that's the high level, bylaws and the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is very rarely changed. That's kind of our founding documents, the fundamental. It's also a legal document because for us to be a 501c3, to be a nonprofit, the government requires that we have a board of directors or a board that oversees us. It requires that we have a constitution. It does not require we have bylaws. So it's both kind of an internal and a external for this working. But the congregation operates by the bylaws and constitution. The next line under that is the board of directors. The board of directors, they manage the church in the month-to-month kinds of decisions. At least that's the old system. The church council would do the month-to-month and sometimes even the day-to-day kinds of decisions. But they are elected by the voters, and in our case we have 7 board of director members, and they kind of have that next tier. Their job is to be accountable to the voters and to give direction to the lower level or the next tier. They operate by what's called the policy manual. Our board of directors has a policy manual, and if you've ever served on the board, you can kind of see it, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it in just a minute, but how they operate. So congregation has bylaws and constitution. The board of directors has the policy manual. The board of directors, their focus is on the what. What should our church be doing? All right, so their focus is not on the how. It doesn't say how we should do it, but on what we should be doing. They should be talking about we want to be reaching to the unchurched in our community. What they will do is they will take that what and they will tell the staff, this is what we want you to do. The staff will figure out the how. So the board does not tell you how it should be done. They tell you what should be done, and the staff works on the how. And we'll dive into it a little deeper. So underneath that board of directors, you kind of have that green one, is the senior pastor, or in an organization that might be the CEO, but in our church it's the senior pastor. And the senior pastor then operates and manages the entire staff. And from there we have different subcommittees and different groups. And only 2 groups that report directly to the board of directors, and that's the endowment committee, and the deacons kind of operate under the pastors, but the endowment, because we're talking about church's money. So that's kind of a very simple org chart of our congregation, what it looks like. How does this work? Just some terms that you can operate under. Constitution, bylaws. The board operates under policies, and the staff operate under procedures. Procedures are how you do something, right? And we have procedures if there's a fire, if there's a storm. We have procedures on how to count the money. We have procedures on enrollment. We have procedures on what if somebody gives a big donation to the church. How do we use that? How's it spent? So the staff, we have procedures that we follow that have been approved by the board, but they don't tell us how to do it. They just simply say, this is where you can do it. Make sure you're doing it. All right? 5 functions of the board. This is the board that you elect. Remember, the voters elect the board. These are 7 members, and you elect them. This is what you elect your board to do. Set the overall mission and strategy of the church. Again, what are we here for? And they're always asking themselves, if Immanuel ceased to exist, what impact would it have on our community? If we just were to go away tomorrow, what impact would it have on our community? If you say none, then why are we here? And you say, well, the impact would be on this area or this area or this area. Are those the right areas we want to have impact? So they're always looking ahead. In a perfect world, the board should not be talking about what's happening now. They should be talking about what's going to be happening in 2 or 3 years. What do we want our church to be in 2 or 3 years? So our board should always be foresight, looking ahead, and then they give that goals, ideas, sometimes it's called ends, policy, and they hand that down to the senior pastor and say, okay, this is what we want to be doing in 2 years, get it done. Yeah.
The board of directors also has to make sure that the rules of the policy governance are followed.
Yeah.
Not set aside.
Yep. And we'll get to that when we talk about, that's part of their ideas, just to make sure they follow that. But yeah, they have that recommendation. But in terms of their general purpose is to look forward and say, this is where the church should be, this is what we need to be done. And they're always, as a part of that, the board is responsible to the voters. So the board should be going to the congregation and saying, what do you as a congregation think we should be doing as ministry? Where do you see us in 3 or 5 years? What are our as congregation? Because they don't make those decisions themselves. They are simply responsive to the voters. And you will see, I think it begins next week or the week after it, we're going to have a survey that we will do at the end of each service for 3 weeks. This is the board trying to say, where do you want us to be? What are areas of ministry we need to strengthen? What are areas that maybe we're lacking? So they're getting input so they can kind of look ahead and say, this is where we want to go. So the board is always looking forward. Monitor the church's performance and hold the pastor accountable. These are really important things that I make a difference in policy base that the others didn't have. Their job is to look and say, okay, Pastor, what's been our general attendance in worship? How are we doing financially? Are the offerings up and down? What is the attitude of the congregation? Is it exciting forward? Is it kind of depressed? Are there fights? Are there things? Not that they're going to tell you how to fix it, but their job is to make sure that there aren't any fires that are popping up and they're accountable. The last one on that list is hold the pastor accountable. Under a church council system, that old system we had, there was very little accountability of the pastor. If the pastor didn't do much in terms of moving the church forward, you just kind of complained about it. You just kind of got frustrated or discouraged. There wasn't a system in place to hold the pastor accountable. In this system, I get evaluated every year. Some of you may have been asked to fill out evaluations. The leadership of the board does it, the staff does it, and then they randomly choose 20 or 30 people to fill out evaluations, and it literally is random. They may go down every 13th name and just pull out name and send you. How many have gotten an evaluation in the past? And we need those. Those evaluations are really important. They're put together, last week, Dave and Jeff and I sat down and we took a couple hours and we literally went through every single thing you wrote on there and what the pastor's doing or not doing. We have some recommendations and some things moving forward. So I get a formal evaluation on a regular basis. My evaluation isn't just, well, is he a good preacher or is he a nice guy or does he play with the kids? But we as the board said, we want to be doing this in 2 years. Are we doing it? So my evaluation said, is the pastor leading the church where the congregation, the board, thinks it should be going? So that evaluation includes those things, which is different than a church council kind of mentality where, well, he doesn't do it, but there's not much we can do about it. So the accountabilities of the pastor is really important in this system. Develop and conserve the church's resources, funds, and facilities. This is not just kind of how much money we have in the bank, but it's also how are we going to use the building? Is it being taken care of? Now they're not going to say that, but if suddenly we realize there's paint chipping on the thing, the board is going to ask me, is that really moving us forward? What are you going to do to clean that up and make sure it's taken care of? And they hold me accountable to make sure that gets done. And I say me because the pastor is the only one the board speaks to as board. Now, Jackie's a part of that, but Jackie works for the senior pastor. And if it doesn't get done, it's my responsibility because the how. So they look at that. Resources isn't also just finances, it may be personnel. If we need a youth director, a music director, or we've got a technology communications person, the board is the one that says that we think this is moving us forward in our direction where we want to go. Or maybe we don't need those anymore. Serve as a bridge and buffer between the church and its community. I don't like that idea of buffer. I just think bridge. So if you as a congregational member, if you're one of those voters and you have some questions or some concerns, you need to go to the board, and that's their job is to listen to you, to incorporate that. If necessary, to say, well, this is why this wouldn't be feasible, or this is why maybe we've gone a different direction. But they should be that point of contact between the congregation and the pastor. So just some general ways that the board operates in our church. This is all under policy-based governance. What policy-based does, which I think is much better than the church council model, is it gives clear lines of authority. Absolutely clear. There's no doubt about who has the right to make what decisions. In a church council system of governance, and some of us grew up under that, maybe heard of it, maybe you operate that in the church you've been in the past, there wasn't always clear lines of who had the right to make what decisions. The example I use often, because it's a real one, is we're in the church council model, the old system. Warren is the chairman of the Buildings and Property Board. Buildings and Property looks at and say, the carpets on the entrance of the church are starting to get worn out. Should we clean them and try to have them refurbished, or should we just buy new ones? So they talk about it and they think about it and says it's something that needs to be done. And after maybe a meeting or two, they decide to get some bids to see how much it would cost to get new ones. They go out and get a couple of bids on how much it costs to get new ones. And their recommendation is that we spend the $500 and replace all the carpets on the and doors to new ones. These lasted 9 years. It's not a bad deal. So they make this decision. They take it to the church council because they don't have really the authority because the church council has to make the decision. The church council gets this recommendation. Now we're 3 months down from the idea that we need to replace those. The church council gets this idea. They argue whether we should replace. Why don't you just have them cleaned one more time? Well, they've already made that conversation. They've had the conversation, but the church council says, we really think, maybe these bids, have you tried to bid from this one? And so they send them back to get 2 more bids and evaluate whether they should be cleaned. So 2 meetings go by, and now we're 5 months down the road. They've already kind of decided what needs to be done. The church council says $500 is a lot for new carpets. We got a voters meeting coming up in 2 months. Let's take it to the voters. So they take this decision about replacing the carpets or cleaning them to the voters. Now you guys are laughing because you know this is how it worked. And so you go to the voters. Now we're 7-8 months down from the time when we need to decide to clean the carpets. And you bring it to the voters meeting. You got a long list of things you come to the voters with. And Warren says, I move that we buy new carpets for $537. We've had 4 bids. This is the best one. We think this best is. Somebody in the back who has no idea what's going on says, oh, we can't afford it, just clean them. The motion passes to just clean them. So now you've had 9 months of conversation, and somebody who really has no input in terms of the day-to-day use of those carpets, how much it costs, whether they're clean or not, makes a motion, and everyone says, yeah, we really can't afford it, the budget's kind of tight, let's just take that out. How do you think Warren feels after spending 9 months to try to discuss this and try to do this thing? Absolutely. Frustrated, discouraged. There's no line of authority or accountability. And that's the way, and you guys laugh about it because you know that's the way that the church council system worked. And the people who are closest to the decision point have no authority to make the decision. Those who are furthest away, that doesn't mean a bad decision, just means that you haven't been studying this for 9 months. And all you can see is how much it costs, and it's a bad decision, so you say no to it. And no wonder we couldn't get people to run for boards because they get frustrated and do all this work and they can't do stuff. And you remember this old system, how hard it was to get people to run for our different boards and committees. It's because they had no authority. We give you a lot of responsibility, but no authority to make the decision. So that was the problem with the old thing. With this new system, if we need to replace carpets at the church, I will go to Jackie and say, give me 3 bids. I think we need to replace carpets. She'd come back and says, there's $540. I say, can we afford that in the budget? She goes, yep, we can afford it. I said, buy the carpets. They'll be here by next week. Jackie and I are here every day. If she says, boy, the budget's kind of tight, I don't think we can afford it, I say, how much is to clean it? Can we get through another season to clean it? She goes, yeah, I think we can get through. We get it cleaned. The decision is right there. Now, you may say, but the pastor shouldn't have that much authority. Possibly true. But I'm staying within the budget. I'm here every day deciding whether that makes our church look better or worn out or tired. I'm the one who's here, and I say I, but I mean as the senior pastor, who's closest to making the decision, and I now have the authority to do it so long as we don't go over budget. Does that make sense? And that happens in everyday thing, whether we're buying computers or whether we're getting new curriculum, because the board has said, we want you to reach this community to have vibrant worship services. We don't care how you do it. Just get it done. So as long as I can do it within the budget, the how isn't that important. And if the church starts to look kind of grubby and grody and the carpets are a pain in the butt, then it's my responsibility because that's going to affect our ability to reach that longer goal. So that's where the accountability comes in. It's really important. Combines authority with responsibility. We just kind of talked about that. We have the authority to do it. Allows the board to focus on mission and ministry. Jeff, I know you were the board chairman for about 25 years? At least it felt like that in the 3 you were served. How many times did you say, we want to do mission, we want to be thinking forward, and how often did you get to do that? Payroll came first. And I know how frustrated you were because we talked many times, we should be thinking mission and ministry, we should be thinking forward, but we had to deal with the fires every day. And that's frustrating. This system is built so that the board always thinks forward. Jane, you've been on there. The board always has to be looking forward. And the day-to-day, the operating, the budget I'm going to leave the staff. The only time the staff would bring it to me is if we're out of budget. And then they have a request, or we demand that they fix it. So it forces the board to think forward. It forces the congregation to be forward-thinking rather than reactive, proactive. Long-range plan focus, streamline routine decisions, accountability of staff. I get a review every year. And if I'm coming back and we establish a budget and I say, oh, we spent $20,000 more than budget, I'm going to be held accountable. Why? What happened? You can't let that happen. Or I say, well, the furnace went out, we had to replace it, I had to make a decision. Okay, what are you going to do to make up that $20,000? How are we going to get that money? They're going to hold me accountable for being out of policy. So there's accountability. That's, I think, is an important part of our process. The difference between an operation and the board, between the board and the staff, we think differently, we act differently. This is really important. The board's job is leadership. This is where we want you to go. The staff's job is management. How do we get there? The what versus the how. Does that make sense? Strategic thinking and planning. We want to be doing this. We're looking ahead. The staff, our operation. How do we get there? What do we need to do to get from point A to point B? So our job is often, staff means how we're going to organize this, how we're going to plan this, how we're going to make this happen. Not what, but the how. The what, the board tells us after talking to the voters. Focus on policy, focus on practice. So the board and the staff operate in two different mentalities. The linchpin, the point where those come together, is the senior pastor. The senior pastor is the point where those things get. So the board operates through the senior pastor then operates through the staff. Now that puts a lot of burden on the senior pastor and staff to get these things done. We don't have a lot of standing committees. We don't have a committee on properties and management. We don't have a committee on evangelism. We don't have a committee on music. What we do is we say, we need a committee to help us, a short-term committee to put together a fall cleanup. So we may gather volunteers to do a fall cleanup, and then you're done. So you're there. If you want to help out in those areas, it's maybe a short-term, project-oriented thing that the staff organizes and puts together. But we don't have a lot of standing committees. All right. So this is how we're operating today, at least in theory. There's two distinct worlds, the board, the governance world versus the management world. Staff dwell in the operational world. The senior pastor is the one who is the link between the two of those. Okay. Yeah.
How does it work for education, Sunday school, how does the system?
It's the same way as it works for everything else. The board of directors says we want our young people to know Christ and to be fully informed Christians, and they leave Immanuel, something like that. That's that greater goal. Pastor, get it done. Now, whether we do confirmation or Sunday school, they don't care about the how. So it's up to the staff if we think Sunday school is the best way to do it, or maybe we say we're going to do something completely different. So long as it's getting our kids fully informed and ready to graduate, we don't care how you get it done, but we want our graduates, our kids, when they come out through our school, to have a Lutheran understanding, to be able to receive the sacrament properly, to be able to go out in the world and defend their faith. How you do that, it's up to you. And you may do the traditional Sunday school, confirmation, those things, or you may do something completely different. Just get it done. Now, it's not completely get done because there's limitations. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's really up to the staff to determine the best way to accomplish the big picture goal, which gives the staff a lot of freedom, right? So that's a good question, and hopefully I can maybe get a little further down. Board speaks with one voice. So when you go into a board meeting, I want our board to have vigorous, passionate disagreements. I want our board to argue over what they think we should be doing in 3 or 4 or 5 years. I do. I want them to be fighting over that. Because when we're having that conversation, vigorous and passionate and committed and saying what's going on here, we're going to pull the best of ideas because they're all working towards this. And it may not be just what Dave thinks it should be. But Bob has some input, and Mariah has some input, and Mariah thinks that Dave's idea has some merit, but maybe should we go a little bit tweak it. When we come out with this, we're going to come out with one voice and say, we have the best of 7 ideas. And it's not Dave's idea or Bob's or Mariah's, it's the church's passion. And so there should be great conversation and passion into our looking forward. But we come out with one voice. And Mariah would never come out of a board meeting and say, well, we're doing this, but that's not what I wanted to do. That can't happen. because you speak with the whole board, because you're speaking for the whole congregation. So it's important that we speak with one voice as board. Board directs the organization with ends or goals. They also direct it with limitations. So I've kind of been saying the board tells the pastor just get it done. Well, it's not completely accurate, because get it done means get it done in any way you want to, so long as you don't cross these boundaries. The board sets the boundaries for the pastor, who sets them for the staff. The boundaries may be, you can't do anything immoral. It's a pretty good boundary, right? You can't do anything unethical or illegal or anything that goes against Scripture. You can't do anything that violates the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's beliefs and practices. So while you say get it done, there are limitations on what you can't do. And so the board limits the pastor with what's called limitation policies and tells you what you can't do. And those are usually pretty broad and pretty general. We don't want to tell you how to do it, but we tell you what you can't do. And the illustration that I like to use here is you've got I think I have it on here. Imagine you've got the University of Michigan football team. I don't know why I picked that just out of the air. You've got the chancellor of the school and the athletic director, and they sit up in the skybox on a Saturday during Michigan football. They give directions to the coach. They are the board. The chancellor and the athletic director, they say, we want you to win, and we definitely want you to beat Ohio State. We're not going to call the plays, but this is our goal, and we want you to graduate 90+% of your students. That's our goal. The coach then says, okay, what do I need to do? He said, well, you can't violate any of the NCAA recruiting rules. Oops, there goes Jim Harbaugh. Sorry. You can't do anything to recruit students that's immoral, unethical, illegal. You have to treat your students, make sure that they graduate. One of our goals. So the board doesn't tell the coach how to do it. He simply says, these are things you can't do. The board doesn't tell Coach Harbaugh what plays to call. He says, win your games, beat Ohio State. I don't care what plays you call, how you get done, just win. So that's kind of how the board and the staff operate. The board tells the pastors what to do in the sense of where they want to go, how many victories we want, what games we want to win, but they don't tell the pastor how to call the plays. They tell you what you can't do, where the boundaries are in the field. So that's how these two operate in board policy. And it seems to be working for us right now. Let's see. I want to do this one. The board has, in our board that you elect, we have 4 areas of policy. They're very distinct, very specific, and every group organization that uses policy-based governance has these same 4 areas. So if you went to another church and they were policy-based, they'd have these same 4. They may call them by different names, but there's only 4 areas of policy that we work. Number 1 is outcomes and goals. What is our long-term picture for this organization? What do we want to task the staff with doing or accomplishing in the next years? That's our long-term goals. They get that by talking to the congregation, saying, where do you want us to go, where areas of ministry we need to improve, those kinds of things. So the number 1 policies are always, sometimes they're called end policies, you can call them goals, you can call them what you want, but that's the number 1, are always that. And they're labeled number 1 goals. The number 2 type policies are those board self-governance, and that's kind of what you mentioned, Warren. How often do we meet as board? We're not talking about the staff, we're not talking about the congregation, but as the 7 of us on board, how often do we meet? What happens if somebody stops coming to meetings? What's the accountability to it? What are the qualifications for a board member? How do we treat each other while we're in board meetings? What happens if we have to call a special board meeting? Those are kind of those internal, how do we operate amongst our 7 kinds of rules? And they have to have those kind of rules, and there's a bunch of those. The number 3 policies is how does the board as an entity, one entity, connect with the rest of the staff? So Bob, as a board member, will not go to John and say, hey, I think as a board member you need to do different colors on the slides for Sunday morning. Bob does not talk to John. Mariah doesn't go to the organist and say, you're playing too loud, you're playing too soft, I want more music, I want less music. I'm on the board and you need to listen to me. The board only speaks to one person as board. They speak to the senior pastor. It's my responsibility to make sure we're accomplishing those long-term goals that we set in number 1. So they speak to the senior pastor. If I think the music is too loud or too soft and it's impacting our ability to reach those goals, it's my responsibility to take care of that. If you just don't like it too loud or too soft or too fast or too slow or whatever, too bad. As board. Now, as individual church member, absolutely. Dave wants to be on the praise team as church member. He takes off his board hat and puts on his church member hat and does the praise team. But he never says, I'm a board member and the praise team is going to be playing on the second Tuesday of every month. He can't speak as board member on the praise team. He's Dave worshiper, Dave member. Does that make sense? So there's a distinct role, but the board only speaks to the senior pastor. Now, in our case, we have Jackie come. She has so much information, but she really speaks on my behalf when she's at the board meetings. So they speak on that behalf. So how they rate the staff. And then the last one are those boundaries that you set for your senior pastor. What are the rules you can't break? You can't spend more than what's in the budget. That would be a limitation. So within that budget, in our case, let's just say we have a $400,000 budget for all of the things we do. You can't spend $401. Now, what they don't say is you have to spend that $400,000 this way, this way, this way, this way, and this way. They don't say that. What they say is you can't spend more than $401,000. So if I need to rearrange the budget to move things because the furnace went out and I think we can pay for it within our budget, I do that. If I think we need new carpets and we didn't budget for carpets, but I can take a little bit out here, a little bit out here, a little bit here, and buy carpets, I do that. You've given me that responsibility and authority, as long as I don't spend $401,000. Does that make sense? So the board gives a lot of authority to the pastor or the leader, whoever that may be, to make those kinds of decisions. Why? Because they're thinking forward, and as long as those decisions are moving us towards those goals, I don't really care. Now, I may have my personal interest. I think we should have washed the carpets rather than buy new ones, but it's not as important as are we moving forward to whatever goals you've set. So we're putting a priority on that. Yeah.
Pastor, you
Yeah.
better have good reasoning if you're charged with spending money.
Yep. And
That you don't.
and there's a lot.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, you spend money on a new furnace.
Yep. And that's my responsibility to make sure I do that, and I'm held accountable if I don't.
What else is important? Maybe seriously important. You got to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And I still have to accomplish the goals that have been set before me because I'm going to be held accountable. So you're absolutely right. You put a lot of trust in your senior pastor to make those kinds of decisions. Now, the overall $400,000 budget, that's voted on by the congregation, but how that's spent, and we kind of give you, this is our intent, this is we want to spend some here, we want to spend some here, we want to spend some here. But within that, we have the freedom to move that. And you're absolutely right. You put a lot of trust in the senior pastor. And if he's breaking that trust, then you limit him even more. You can't spend $20,000 on a furnace. And you can write a policy that limits him. As long as you trust him, you may be given the freedom until he breaks that trust, and then you write a new policy. So you're absolutely right. It depends on how the board's set up. In our case, you don't have to, as long as we stay within that. Because the voters have given the board the authority to help that. Now, that's enough for right now. But that's just a really brief look at how Immanuel operates as a congregation. It's not perfect. We can always improve it, but that's our intent, to get the decision closer to the person with the authority and the accountability, to apply accountability to the pastor, to hold me accountable. I have to hold my staff accountable. That means if somebody needs to be disciplined or encouraged or trained or, heaven forbid, fired, that's my responsibility to do that. Because the board only speaks to the senior pastor. All right. Blast through it. Usually it takes about 5 hours. And I know those of us who've been through it, Jeff, we're working on it, and I got lots of stuff from this week and best practices to talk about. We're trying to do this over at Valley. It's quite a task. So if you have questions about how the church operates, please don't talk to me, talk to Dave. No. Who's our board members here right now? I know Dave's here, Jason's here. Is this pretty close to how we're trying to do it? There are things we can tweak on, things we can work on, but let's do it, and we go from there. So we'll pick up a different topic next week, but that just kind of gives you a sense of how Immanuel operates. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to be here today and to help us to do all of these things, whether it's a policy-based governance or whether it's a church council governance. Lord, help us always be in mind that the purpose is to share the resurrection joy with the community, to share the good news of Jesus Christ with those who need to hear it the most. And all the nuts and bolts and the intricacies of how that gets done, are really left up to us, Lord. You give us freedom. Help us to use that freedom wisely, as be good stewards of it, so that we may do the work you've given us to do. Thank you for those who are with us today. Bless them in their daily walk through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you very much. Have a blessed morning.